So recently, the lead singer for Imagine Dragons, the singer Dan Reynolds, announced that he is stepping away from the church. And frankly, anytime someone steps away from the church, we should mourn. After all, this is not about someone leaving an institution. It's about the abandonment of one's covenants with Christ. Covenants that create a special kind of relationship with Christ. Just as the unique marital relationship is built on sacred, ritualized vows, so too is our relationship with Christ, built on faithfulness to our sacred covenants with Him. This is not about some club losing a member, but about a child of God fundamentally altering their relationship with Him. Now, Dan's story is a common one. Dan lost his faith in the Lord's definition of marriage and became an activist against the doctrines in the family proclamation. And in some sense, this should not shock us. Losing your faith is the default position. The walk with Christ is an uphill road towards ideals that can seem at times impossible in this fallen world. It's perfectly natural for a person to change their direction. But where is Dan going now? You see, the question to ask when someone is leaving is not why they are leaving. That's usually not that hard to figure out. The question to ask is, where are you going now? And I want to say that again. The question is not, why are you leaving? The question is, where are you going now? The Huffington Post released an article on Dan that gave some insight. In it, Dan said, quote, "I'm on a different path. I have to love myself enough to follow my truth." Take a minute to analyze this. This kind of vague platitude peddling may be popular amongst the unintelligent, but when examined seriously, it falls apart really fast. A different path? Yes, we all know you are on a different path. But a path towards what? Why should we think it's a better path? Is this an actual path with a particular direction, with a particular set of moral principles undergirding it? Or is this just wandering about doing whatever seems popular in your given social context as a pop singer in the 21st century in the United States? Love yourself? What does that mean? Allowing yourself to do whatever you want? If I love my child, does that mean I want them to do whatever they want? He says he has to love himself enough to follow his truth. Really? His truth? I have found that the person who says, "I am living my truth," is really just using fancier words to say, "I am doing whatever I feel like." I am not really concerned with your truth or my truth. I am concerned with the truth. If Dan's new path is headed toward moral relativism, he should know that it's a well-worn path of incoherence that many have followed towards broken relationships.
Well, the consequence of relativism is that in the end we'll each have our own reality. I have my reality, you have your reality. What objective truth says is that there's one you, there's one reality. And truth for me and truth for you are bound to that same reality. And if that's not the case, if we each have our own truth, and therefore we each have our own reality, the consequence of that is that ultimately communication itself becomes impossible. If our words don't have some kind of fixed meaning, then communication becomes impossible. And in fact, we each live in our own worlds, isolated in our own world, not even really able to communicate. In the classical understanding, there's reality. And reality is the measure of truth for me, and the very same reality is the measure of truth for you. How are we going to decide on a meaning of something? If reality doesn't determine the meaning, and we each have our own truths, well then what's the only possibility? If we're going to decide on a meaning, then either I have to make you yield to my meaning, or you have to make me yield to your meaning. There's no arbiter that stands outside of both of us, to which we both have to submit. Either I submit to you, or you submit to me. And there's no way out. There's no way out of that. I think that's why Sartre, in a play entitled No Exit, No Way Out, ends with the famous statement that hell is other people. And if we're all defining our own reality, if truth is relative to each of us, well then, what do we do when we confront the other? We have to make that other yield to our vision of truth, to our vision of reality. But the other's going to do the same to us. And so we're going to be locked in this conflict with the other. Whose vision will win? Whose vision will prevail? And so intimacy becomes impossible. And the realm of intimacy, the realm of interpersonal intimacy becomes a battleground. It's the battle of the gods. Because we're each creating our own universe. We're each creating our own cosmos. And whose cosmos will be the prevailing cosmos? Well, the one who has more power. The one who has the power to make the other yield. It's kind of ironic because it can seem that relativism can provide a way in which, hey, well, we can all just get along because hey, I got my truth, you got your truth. And maybe as long as we can stay as far apart from each other as possible, each dwelling in our own universes, such that our universes kind of collide as little as possible, kind of like as atomistically separated as possible, well then maybe we can avoid conflict. We can avoid the inevitable conflict of determining whose universe will be the prevailing universe. But that's a system that's predicated upon isolation. That's predicated upon the greatest possible separation of each individual little God. And that's just it's a devastating vision of the human person, because it precisely goes against our deepest instinct, which is our deepest instinct, in fact, for intimacy and for communion. You're not going to be able to have true communion unless you can have a common language, and the only source of that common language is going to be a common reality that you share, not as a God of that reality, but as a receiver of that reality. Both, as I said before, both equally subject to reality, not each creating our own reality, but equally sharing in that which is given to us.
What's even more sad in all this is to see how this abandonment of the very concept of moral truth affects the way that Dan views his role as a parent to his 4 children. Dan said, quote, "I really don't want to try to tell them what their spiritual path should be. I give them my thoughts and obviously try to protect them and take care of them, while also making sure they have freedom and agency to choose whatever they want." Think about this statement for a minute. Are you really doing your job as a parent if you tell your child to do whatever they want? Sure, we want our kids to freely choose. We want to inspire them to make the right choices rather than forcing them to make the right choices. But don't we still want our kids to choose the right, to choose virtue, to choose goodness, to align themselves with moral truth? Don't we want to protect our children from the harm that comes to themselves and to others as a consequence of doing what is wrong? Now, of course, Dan will have no problem telling his kids they should not be racist or bigoted. You see, Dan does have a moral compass, but his compass is not calibrated to Christ. It's calibrated to whatever is popular in his given social context. It should not surprise us that Dan's new worldview just happens to be moving closer and closer to the norms of the pop music industry. It's the mantra, do whatever you want, just don't be a bigot. And it's popular because it's based to some extent in truth. It's true that love does not manipulate, it does not coerce, but it does influence. Love is not apathetic. Love does not assume that all paths lead to happiness. Those who love seek to persuade the beloved to find and embrace the good and the true and the beautiful for their own good. Dan, like many parents, say they don't want to impose their beliefs on their children. But does he think that this world is not going to try and impose its beliefs on his children? Does he assume that the world is a neutral playing field? Children are children. Parents who love them will want to inspire their child to embrace the just, the good, the true, the beautiful, so their children will be equipped to deal with life and all of its challenges. So again, if Dan is leaving the church, where is he going? Wandering in the midst of relativism while seeking popularity hardly seems like a coherent life strategy. But that's just the thing. People think they can just stop believing. They think they can just say, I lost my faith. No, that's not true. You can lose your faith in Christ, but you always place your faith in something.
Religious is what you act out.
Anything you act out.
Everything you act out is predicated on your implicit axioms. And the system of implicit axioms that you hold as primary is your religious belief system. It doesn't matter whether you're an atheist or not. That's just surface noise.
So it has nothing to do with divinity or supernatural beings?
No.
Or it doesn't necessarily have to do with those?
No, it probably necessarily has to do with it too, but it doesn't necessarily have anything to do with your voluntarily articulated statements about whether or not you believe in something like a transcendent deity. So, I mean, what you act out is much more what you are than what you say about yourself. And what the hell do you know about what you believe anyways? You're complicated, man.
It's a fair question.
Well, seriously, people are complicated. You know, like we're not transparent to ourselves at all. That's why we have to go to university and study psychology. It's like, you know, we're not exactly black boxes, but we are the most complicated things there are, right? And we can't even program our VCR clocks. So it's like, how the hell can we propose to understand ourselves? And, you know, I'm existentially oriented, which is to say that I think that what you hold to be true is best determined as a consequence of an analysis of your actions rather than as a consequence of an analysis of what you purport to believe. Now, in order to act, you can't act without a hierarchy of value, which I tortured the other poor questioner about. You can't act without a hierarchy of values because you can't act unless you think one thing is better than another. Because why would you act otherwise? So that means that you're embedded within a hierarchy of values, whether you know it or not, or maybe multiple fragmentary and competing hierarchies of value, which is all the worse for you, by the way, because it just makes you very confused. That hierarchy of values has an axiomatic, it's based on axioms. And the probability that you understand them is very low, because generally people don't understand their axioms. But that axiomatic system is essentially your religious system. And there's no way out of that as far as I can tell. And you can say, well, it isn't predicated on conscious belief in a transcendent deity. It's like, okay, have it your way. But, you know, most people in this room act out a Judeo-Christian ethic. And not only do they act it out, if they're treated in a manner that's not commensurate with that ethic, they get very, very, very annoyed. So, for example, if I fail to treat you as if you're an embodiment of a divine fragment, let's say, that's characterized by the ability to make free choice and to determine your own destiny in some sense, or if I fail to treat you as if you're a valued contributing member of the polity as a sovereign individual, then you'll find that very offensive and become angry. It's like, okay, then that's what you believe. Well, if I ask you if you believe any of that, well, that's a whole different story. You might give me some radical leftist nonsense, but that doesn't take away from what you've. That doesn't take away from the fundamentals of your action.
So, where will you go? Everyone who acts in the world manifests where they have placed their faith. and something will occupy the top of your hierarchy of values. So the question is not if you have faith. The question is, what have you placed your faith in? Hey guys, if you enjoyed this video, be sure to hit that subscribe button so my future videos show up on your feed. Also, if you or someone that you know has benefited from the content here on Thoughtful Faith, please consider becoming a channel donor or volunteer by visiting my new website, thoughtfulfaith.org, and clicking on the Get Involved page.